Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are doing the second half of our two-part podcast on answering your questions. So we're just taking some questions from our listeners and speaking to each of them one by one. Are you ready?
I am.
I like these, and I think we need to do more of those if we can hear from more people. I think it's good for us to really speak to what people really want to know most about the Enneagram, and there are a lot of questions out there that are really good ones.
Yeah, and again, we got so many of those good questions. I'm very thankful to our listeners, and we decided not to answer a few of them because they inspired us to do full podcast episodes in the future.
Yes, so if we don't answer your question, it means that we are planning a whole podcast. We're going to devote a whole podcast to that question in particular because it was such a good one.
And in few cases, we might not have answered some question because it also triggered some theory discussions between the two of us, and we are working on those to come up with the very best answer.
Okay, so the first question that I thought we could answer, and it is kind of a complicated one, but I think one that a lot of people may want to hear about. And that is, the person asks, are there any tips on how to determine your core motivation or your core fear that are used to figure out your dominant type? So we know that for each of the 9 types, each type has a really core motivation and a core fear. And I think different authors and theorists might name that core fear differently. And so it might be good to say that different people may define core motivation and core fear differently around the 9 types. So we'll say what we believe here in terms of answering this question. So the question is how to determine your core motivation, core fear, that's usually at the heart of the type description for each of the 9 types. What would you say to this question?
I would say that if you want answers to questions like these, you should look at the type's passion and sometimes the type's fixation, and period. So my impression is that while I also like this kind of description when it's well done, it's not always that it's well done. When it's serious and the Enneagram teacher practitioner offering the answers knows what they're talking about, then it's nice, it's good. But don't trust all that you see, right? And I like those. But while I like those, I think that at times we go too far away from what's really central to understand type. If we stick a bit more to what is the type's passion and the type's fixation, we will work with something that is more strategic to promote inner work and to understand what that type is truly about. And when it comes to the biggest fear, I believe that the 9 passions hold the answer to that. And we had an episode that we explained the 9 passions or emotional vices. So just to give you an example, sometimes people say that the biggest fear of type 8 is weakness or vulnerability. And fine, I like this answer, but I think there is a better way to explain what is type 8's fear, and that is to be small. And this is because of lust being the passion, meaning excess and being larger than life. So I think that being small encompasses the being weak and being vulnerable, but explains it better when it comes to the biggest fear. So if you look at the type's passion, you will understand what the type is avoiding out of what is fear. But it's also not only fear. It's also resistance. There are other things to talk about it. So my fear is that when we go to this kind of classification, that we don't necessarily talk about the main thing that is happening there.
I do think that what you're saying is really important. And when we're talking about the core motivation and the core fear of the types, one of the first places to look is the passion. I think the hard part is, the tricky part is, the passions aren't exactly so clear themselves. For instance, if we look at pride of the two, I think many of us can understand what pride is, but even twos have a hard time understanding how it operates in them. And then how is pride connected to a core fear? I don't necessarily think it's that obvious. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's hard. And I think that the question from our listener, which by the way is a great question, I refer to the fact that, talking about the main fear and other things makes it difficult for people to identify type, because for most it's unconscious, right? So I agree with that. And I think it's even more difficult when it comes to the passion, because it might be even more unconscious. This is why you and I don't really use much the passions when it comes to helping people identify type. We have a whole method of key factors to look for to help people identify their types that are a bit easier to be observed, even in initial levels of self observation. Uh, so, using the passion as a way to observe myself is different, though. It's not to find out my type, but to understand more of the core of what my type is and what I need to do to go beyond my personality.
Yeah, and again, I think that although it's really true that the passion holds a lot of keys to understanding the core motivations and core fear, I don't necessarily think that answers this question, because there's even more work to do, right? Once you know the passion. So for instance, going back to my example, so if I'm a two and my passion is pride, what exactly is my core motivation? What exactly is my core fear? A core fear of twos, I believe, is not being loved, or not being seen, or not being seen as important. I would say those are very important. Now, I also think sometimes there are fears that twos have that are connected to not always feeling a solid sense of self, but now we're getting into other territory. So I think when we're talking about core fears, this is a really important question, but it's not always something that's so easy and straightforward even to know about the types. So, for instance, taking a couple other types, for ones, if the passion is anger, what does that mean the core motivation and the core fear are? So I think I'm liking this question more and more, because I'm realizing I think we need to do more work around clarifying what the core motivations and core fears are of the types, in a way that people of different types can more readily identify before, like you said, they get to the part about where they understand what the passion is, and they understand how to observe themselves to see how the passion motivates their behavior, which I think is a more sophisticated step along the path of development that one takes when working with the Enneagram.
Yes, sure. I agree with you also.
So here's another thing I would say in answer to this question that I think is in a whole other realm in a way. And that is, I think one of the things this person is asking about is self observation. Once you can even describe what the core motivation or core fear is of a particular type, I think this person is saying sometimes when people are still working on self awareness, or when they're at the beginning of their path and they're just learning what self awareness really means, it can be hard to understand even in yourself what's motivating me, what are my biggest fears, and how are those driving me, and which one is more core than another one. And so I think one answer to this question is that the Enneagram invites us to really self-observe in a whole different way than we may have ever done before. It means becoming very mindful, and as Gurdjieff talked about, practicing self-remembering, which is a very, very specific, detailed way of observing yourself. It's like mindfulness, but mindfulness all the time, and mindfulness watching yourself. What am I paying attention to now? When I wake up in the morning, what am I thinking about now? What am I focusing on as I think about my day, or as I wake up from sleep? When I go into a new situation, what do I pay attention to? I think, a lot about noticing what you focus your attention on, because that's often the clue to what motivates you the most or what you fear most. And if I think about myself, especially for many years of my life, and when I was, in therapy and things like that, I think it was a lot of noticing how much real estate got taken up in my mind space by thinking about relationships, or wondering how people were thinking about me or feeling about me, or thinking about a particular person in my life who is very important to me, and what's going on in that relationship. How is that person thinking about me now? Or what can I do to connect with that person? So if I think about how I knew I was a two, reading about what twos pay attention to, and then noticing that that's what I was thinking about all the time, was a really important thing. So I think another answer to this question is yes, once you learn about your Enneagram type, the next step, or even as you're learning about your Enneagram type, or as a way of learning about your Enneagram type, a big piece of this is learning to be more self-aware, which is about learning to self-observe, learning to continually ask yourself the question, what am I focusing on now? What am I paying attention to now? What am I thinking about now? What am I feeling now? And how is that related to what I'm paying attention to now? It's a lot of that kind of work that helps us understand, oh, here I am again thinking about this thing, like threes, thinking about their to-do list, or focusing on tasks, or thinking about their goals, and thinking a lot about how am I going to reach that goal today, or this week, or this month, or this year. These are the things that each type focuses attention on. And often the core fear is underlying that, right? Like if a three is thinking a lot about getting a project done, or accomplishing tasks, or doing things, there are core fears underlying that. One core fear might be, if I don't reach my goal, I won't look good and I won't earn people's love. Another core fear might be, if if I run out of things to do, my feelings might bubble up. And that's scary, because I'm not used to allowing myself to go into the depth of my emotion. And that can feel disorienting when it first happens. So I need to keep going. So I think there's a lot to be said about this. And these may be things we want to do another podcast on, is how can we begin to understand the core motivations and the core fears of all the types, knowing that passion is definitely one big category of understanding that we can find clues to these things in, but I think this person is really, can we spell this out a bit more to help guide people's self-awareness and self-observation?
Yes, I agree with you. And let's do this other episodes sometime, maybe next year, 2021.
And if people are listening to this and they're still finding out their type, I think these are good questions to ask themselves. What am I most afraid of? And can I continue to ask myself that question and notice if it's the same answer over time in some cases, or if it changes day to day? And I think there may be different levels of motivations and different levels of fear. And some motives and some fears are more core. They're more at the deep level. And like you said, I think the tricky thing about the Enneagram is often these are more unconscious. And so I think we can ask these questions and know that some of the times the answers will be about the patterns and habits that we're in that tend to be more conscious. But that with the Enneagram, we need to keep studying. We need to keep asking, because as we ask, we'll get to deeper and deeper levels. And you know what that's reminding me of? It's reminding me of one practice or one activity that is often done in personal growth workshops. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of the Diamond Heart work, where they use a method of inquiry. And one of the big methods they use of inquiry, and I think we've sometimes used this in our retreats and workshops, is the repeating question. And the idea is that you get you get with a partner, and one person asks you, and let's say you ask, like, what do you fear most? That might be a good repeating question. And if someone's sitting there in front of you, and maybe for 15, 20 minutes, that person continues to say thank you, and then asks the question again. The interesting thing about that inquiry method is you start at kind of the top level, usually, of what you're most conscious of. And as you continue to ask that question, it's as if the answers you give get deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think the answer to this question is a little bit like this: as we're seeking to be more aware of ourselves, which is what the Enneagram is all about. It's about continuing to ask yourself some of these questions and continuing to observe what your answers are. And you may want to write about that, or you may want to talk to someone you trust about that, or you may want to bring that into therapy. But I think that the whole point is to continue asking these questions and continue to study yourself, almost like you would study a topic outside yourself. To really know that you have layers to you, and that there are going to be conscious layers and less conscious layers. And when you're really working with your Enneagram type, you're really seeking to understand deeper and deeper levels of you. Let's do a short break.
Bea and Uranio teach in-person inner work retreats and professional workshops all over the world. They happen twice a year in California, London, Shanghai, Sao Paulo, and Cairo, and sometimes in other countries and US locations too. Hundreds of students from all places and levels of knowledge have joined these courses. You can see the full Chestnut Paes Enneagram Academy calendar of events at www.cpenneagram.com. Become a member now at Chestnut Paes online for a lot more Enneagram content from Bea and Uranio. Sign up for the annual plan and get access to hundreds of audio files, videos, monthly online classes, articles, and even full online Enneagram workshops. It's a great value. Visit www.cpenneagram.com.
So let's move on to another question. I think that was a good one, and a very gave us a rich opportunity to talk about self-observation and core motives and fears. Here's more of a type-based question. Someone asks, can you say more about sevens who are not the typical extroverted types? And one of the things this reminds me of, we talk a lot, and this is one of the things I'm glad we talk a lot about. We talk a lot about how different types get stereotyped, and how there are many myths and misconceptions about the 9 types. And this is, of course, one of the problems in the Enneagram world, and especially as the Enneagram gets more popular. And there are many voices out there and many different Enneagram sources and memes that sometimes we can think about the types in ways that tend to be more superficial. So I like this question because it helps us say what I think we often need to talk about. It never gets old, is that we need to be careful about stereotyping. And this person is saying, can you say more about sevens who are not typical extroverted types? And there's a second part to this question. And the second part is, can sevens ever end up looking or feeling sad, more pessimistic than optimistic, indecisive and ruminating, or does that mean they're mistyped? So I think these are good questions. And what I would say, and then I want to hear what you think, is that none of the types are always extroverted or introverted. Now, of course, there are some types that tend to be more extroverted or introverted. 5s, often tend to be more introverted, and 7s can tend to be more extroverted. But I know several 7s that I believe are more introverted and would describe themselves as more introverted, because sometimes 7s can just be very mental and very creative, and they can be more inside themselves and do more on their own to think about things, do different things, express different interests. They're not always out in the world being extroverted.
Yeah, I believe I think you said the main things about it. I just want to compliment by saying that sevens many times in actuality feel like they are introverts, and at the same time they act outside as if they were not. They can't at times sustain the seven image or persona if they don't make as if they were more like extroverts than they are. It's like sevens many times consciously start telling jokes and being fun and entertaining when they are not feeling good for any reason. Sometimes that's not conscious, but other times it is conscious. And I've seen a seven who has a very good degree of self-observation define once that she felt like as a seven, she was an introvert in the inside only, not in the outside. So I think that explains a bit what that is. And it's fun for me to see how many seven kids are very much introverts. It's that thing that at times we show one of our arrows and maybe even more the arrow against during childhood, which is 5 for sevens. And like my son used to be very much like an introvert in the beginning, and now he doesn't look like that in the outside. Although, if you really see his life, he spends a lot of time alone and with himself and thinks a lot and with himself. And then you also said like fives tend to be mostly introverts, and that is true. That's my experience with fives. However, as a five, when I do Myers-Briggs assessment, I come up as an E, not an I, meaning extrovert and not introvert. So it's tricky. And it's better if we don't go to this kind of appraisal when it comes to type. And also because if we don't consider instinct and subtypes, we will get it wrong. My experience also is that there is a bigger tendency for people to be introverts when self-preservation instinct is high. And that's also not an absolute rule, so it's complex.
Yes, I was also thinking that self-preservation sevens, in my experience, can be a little bit more on the introverted side than the other sevens. But again, I think any of the 3-7 subtypes can be introverts. And so it's very important not to generalize. And like we're saying, I think sometimes someone can look extroverted in some circumstances or some aspects of their lives, but consider themselves more introverted in other aspects of their lives. Like someone who, let's say, has a job where they speak in front of people a lot. Sometimes that can make them seem extroverted, but in their time off or when they're more alone, they like to be by themselves a lot more. And so I think this is one of those things that we need to be careful about making quick judgments about, and recognize that all of the types can be introverted or extroverted, and that this is not necessarily something that's completely attached to type. Now, I want to take the second part of this, and the person's saying, can sevens ever end up looking or feeling sad, more pessimistic than optimistic, and more indecisive? Or does that mean they're mistyped? So I would say one aspect of this is how much self-development work the 7 has done. I think that sevens who haven't done a lot of inner work, who are maybe new to inner work, usually look more obviously optimistic and not so sad. They tend to more be happy or feel compelled to be happy more of the time. It can feel threatening to feel sadness or pain or other uncomfortable emotions. And if we're talking about core fears, I think one of the core fears of sevens is getting trapped in an uncomfortable emotional experience. And this is a big part of what drives sevens and why they like to have freedom and why they like to be able to have options and not necessarily feel limited from the outside in any way, because they want to be able to find an escape route. Now, that said, I think when sevens work on themselves more, and this can even be having had a history that was more challenging, or, a history of trauma. Sometimes sevens who have dealt with that, who have really taken the invitation from life to deal with more of their difficult experiences, have a lot of access to sadness and can be more pessimistic. And certainly, as you often point out, the fear of being trapped in something unpleasant can make sevens quite pessimistic. It's the idea that things are going to be bad if I allow myself to feel whatever I feel in the moment. So I need to keep moving. I need to move on. I need to think about the next interesting thing and keep up a fast pace. But certainly, I think sevens, like all of us, and this is very important, like all of us, have sadness. They have pain. They've had difficult experiences in their lives. I think this is just part of being human. And I think when sevens really work on understanding their personality and moving beyond the personality identifications or the ways they get caught up in their habitual ways of being, they often get in touch with sadness and pain and difficult feelings underneath the surface level. And we've met a lot of sevens that are doing really deep, important inner work that are this way and that express a lot of emotion. And so it's important to recognize that that doesn't mean they're mistyped. It can mean they're just doing their inner work.
Yeah, I really appreciate your answer to this, B. And I would just add a minor aspect to what you've already said. And that is that many times sevens, even when they haven't yet developed in consciousness, they do suffer also. It's just that they do their best to keep it short and so that people don't see them suffering. So they are known for not going out when they're sad and crying, inside their rooms when alone, but hoping that the next day they will be okay already. So it's not exactly that they don't suffer, even when they haven't done inner work.
Yes, that's really important. I'm glad you added that. So the next question I think would be good to address, also a type-based question. Can you say something about twos showing up with significant anxiety or fear? And this person says fear of others. And I do think this is a good question. And when I do typing interviews, one of the basic questions I ask everyone to answer to see what they say as a way of helping them find their type. I always ask about fear, and I start by asking a very open-ended question, which is, what's been your experience of fear in your life? And again, when you're doing a typing interview, you want to ask a general question to hear what someone's story is about that particular emotion or that particular experience. And what sixes will answer to that question is very different than what other types will answer to that question. But of course, all types have fear. All types can experience anxiety, but it looks different depending on what type you are. I often say that there are 9 kinds of depression, for example. I think there are 9 kinds of anxiety and fear. And what we often find is some twos will say, yes, I experience a significant amount of fear or anxiety in my life. And then I always ask, my next question is, and again, when I'm doing a typing interview, I don't know what type they are yet, but my next question, if someone says, yes, that's a big theme in my life, I do experience fear. The next question is, what does it tend to be about? So what is your fear or anxiety about? What are the themes? What causes it? And it's different depending on what type you are. And what I find is for heart types, and particularly twos, the fears will be more specific than, say, a six's fears. And it also depends on what subtype the person is. So I also I start listening for what is self-preservation fear versus, say, the fear of a 6. And of course, for 6s, fear is not only part of what drives them as part of the head triad, or the fear triad, the head-based triad, but also fear is the passion of type 6. But the self-preservation instinct can add a several themes that have to do that cause fear and anxiety. But also 2s sometimes have an anxiety around bad things happening to people they love, so losing someone they love. They often also may have anxiety or fear around being rejected by others or excluded by others. And they can also sometimes have anxiety around a feeling of insubstantiality. And I find that with 2s, it's almost as if, because I'm looking outside myself so much for affirmation, I tend to shapeshift and become whoever people want me to be, or whoever I need to be liked or approved of by others, which can leave me with a feeling of almost existential anxiety, like I don't exist. And for instance, I've heard a few 2s have fear of like crossing bridges or when they're driving. And this can reflect a kind of lack of groundedness in myself. Like my ground is sort of out there with all of you, and finding out how you think and feel about me. And so not always like a solid sense of grounding in my own sense of self and my own sense of valuing myself. So these are some of the fears and anxieties I've seen in 2s. But what more would you say about that?
Oh, you brought very clarifying information about Jews. I appreciate that a lot. All I want to add is something else. Enneagram type does not explain everything. So the Enneagram is such a brilliant system that explains so much and so much more than other systems, that sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that it explains all of us. But it's not really like that, because there are aspects that can generate, for instance, fear that are not particularly related to type. So trauma, for instance, it can happen with any of the 9 types, and you know, the person can be more fearful than others of that type because of trauma. And it's not only trauma. There are several factors that may lead to some slightly different feelings or even behaviors that a person has when compared to others of the same type. We've been mapping some factors like this. We call them assessment factors for one of our workshops, professional workshops. And it's amazing to see how many people display stuff that is not the most common thing for their types.
Yeah, this is a very important topic. In fact, we're going to do a whole podcast on the Enneagram types in relation to the impact of childhood trauma. This is an area that we're very interested in because this is some of what we work with when we do our deep inner work retreats, because we're asking the question, how can Enneagram type help us understand what's going on in a person, what motivates them, what helps them grow, and how do they get stuck? And often the Enneagram types are a reflection of the defensive pattern. And the defensive pattern often need to come up and come up strongly if someone went through a lot of difficult experience. And so many people, I mean, there's almost no one who hasn't gone through an experience of trauma in their life. And childhood trauma has a particular effect in really shaping a person's experience. And certainly the Enneagram types have a role to play in helping us understand both how someone has defended against the experience of trauma, how that has shaped the way they walk in the world, and also how to heal trauma. And so that's a really important topic. And I just want to let people know that we're thinking a lot about this. We work with this, and our plan is to do a whole podcast, at least one podcast, on how the different types uh, respond to childhood trauma and how that shapes the different ways that the types show up. And I do think that as you know, we also talk a lot about typing people and how to help people find their correct type, because there's so much mistyping that happens. And I do think that one thing that a lot of people don't consider when they're typing themselves or when they're helping someone else type themselves, because I do a lot of typing interviews, and sometimes it's with people who have been struggling for a long time to find their Enneagram type. And I often find they have stories about having talked to an Enneagram coach or an Enneagram teacher who actually steered them in the wrong direction because they asked them a question and they say, well, if you're like this, then you can't be that type. And really what they're drawing on is something relatively superficial that's not necessarily relevant to determining type in an absolute way. And I think often they aren't taking account of the impact of childhood trauma and how that can mean that someone's type shows up a bit differently in ways that we can understand. I like that you brought up the impact of trauma, and I think it gives us a chance to highlight the fact that we're thinking about that, and we will be talking more about that going forward. Let's do a short break.
If you like this podcast, visit www.cpenneagram.com for much more great Enneagram content. Have you already subscribed for Bea and Uranio's YouTube channel? Go to YouTube and search for Chestnut Paes and click on like and subscribe. Did you know you can study with Bea and Uranio and work toward becoming a certified Chestnut Paes Enneagram professional? Join one of their workshops for professionals interested in integrating the Enneagram in skillful and effective ways to build your confidence applying the Enneagram as a tool to support your clients' growth and development. Learn how at www.cpenneagram.com.
Okay, so another question that someone asked, which I think is a really good one, is what does psychological work look like in the Enneagram work for each type or more generally? And they're referencing the fact that we recently did a spiritual bypass episode, but they're asking, like, if we focus more on the psychological dimensions, what kind of work is this? And we're thinking a lot about this, and this is probably most directly related to the work we're doing on creating and elaborating a model of levels of awareness according to the Enneagram. And we're building our model directly on the Enneagram symbol, because as we know, the Enneagram symbol is not only a typology of 9 types, but it's also a process model or a process map. It maps a process of movement, of transformation. And so we'll be talking a lot more about that as well. We're working a lot on that. And I know, Uranio, you're really thinking a lot about this all the time and coming up with new ideas and ways to refine this and make it more clearly. But what would you say about this? What does psychological work look like in the Enneagram model for each type, or more generally? What are some things we can say about that here?
I want to start talking about it more generally. I want to say that one thing that I see is Enneagram people being quite interested in newer psychological approaches. And when I say newer, I'm talking about recent decades, right? So many people are interested in family constellations, which I love. Many are interested in some trauma healing work, like EMDR. And several other approaches, and I love that. They are really good. But sometimes I am a bit afraid that people who do Enneagram work bypass the most common psychotherapy work, which is one-on-one, which is every week, and which tries to investigate things like parental issues and complexes. And I think that should not happen for one who is doing inner work. That is absolutely essential. And doing therapy with one therapist and regularly, not only episodes that you go do a random piece of work, which sometimes can happen when you do family constellations or any workshop on healing techniques. It's really important to engage on a process on a certain point of your journey. Now, having said all that, I think that in the beginning, each type might benefit from a kind of a therapy that is more engaging for their dominant center of intelligence. So I've seen some fives in the beginning benefit a lot from talking therapy, even psychoanalysis and so on. I've seen body types really benefiting from more somatic therapy of different kinds, like bioenergetics or Reichian lines and other ones, somatherapy. And I've seen many heart types benefiting from more emotional based psychotherapy of different kinds. And I would include also cognitive behavior therapy for mental types. But at the same time, when you do a little bit of that, then you need to move on, and you need to do the kind of therapy that is a bit less. It's a bit more counter-instinctive for you, a bit more difficult. So fives will need to go do Gestalt, or body types will need to do talk therapy, or heart types will need to do body work, or even more mental kinds of therapy. And that is a smart move, so that you develop your blind spots and other areas and functions in your psyche. So there's no absolute formula here. And I really like some of the very early pieces of work by Ken Wilber, when he classified all different kinds of therapy according to levels of awareness. So I think there are good models out there that talk about what therapy to do and when. But what I'm definitely about is that everybody needs to keep an eye on when there is a need to change the technique, to move even from one therapist to another, to try out a new line of therapy, and to be able to challenge yourself more when the current approach is getting a bit comfortable for your ego.
Yes, and I would add to that there are some basic things that we all need to work on psychologically in order to be more whole, in order to really know ourselves at a deeper level, in order to incorporate blind spots and things like that. And I would say, for one thing, we need to deal with our mother and father issues, with our family of origin issues. If we've had trauma, if we have issues with a sibling or family systemic issues, these are really important things to look at and deal with and work through in therapy, especially if you had a difficult experience. But even if you didn't, we all have ways that we hold ourselves back unconsciously out of still waiting for that thing we didn't get from our parents, or reenacting over and over again a dynamic that we suffered from in our upbringing, in our early life. So these are things that we all need to do. I also would say shadow work. We all need to learn about what's in our shadow. What do we tend to avoid being conscious of? What aspects of ourselves do we think are unacceptable in some ways? And certainly the Enneagram types give us a lot of information about what tends to remain unconscious, what tends to be blind spots, what tends to hide out in the shadow of each of the 9 types. And I think another category related to this would be emotional work. We need to be really understanding, how do we unconsciously avoid awareness of certain emotional experiences? And to the extent that we do that, we are not whole. We are avoiding certain human experiences that we all need to have and be able to face and work through and integrate. So we, as you often say, we need to be in touch with all 4 basic human emotions. And I think 3 of them are the core emotions of the human ego: fear, sadness, or grief at separation, and anger. And these are 3 that have to do with the distress that we feel early on, and that we react to defensively. And that's part of how our personality structure gets set in place and fixed in place and shaped to some degree by our experience. Although, of course, we believe that we come in with a type in place already. And then that in many ways, informs how we react defensively when we experience distress. And so to the extent that our brains have a role in this, to extent that we all get stuck in patterns of defense that become deeply habitual, we need to understand what those are, and we need to consciously walk toward the things that we avoid being aware of, so that we aren't living our lives running away from those things, because we don't see how we do that. And that's the main I think, goal of psychological work, is freeing up the energy that we unconsciously expend. And we can expend a lot of it defending ourselves from experiences that we don't want to have, or we don't want to repeat or re-experience from early life. And that's a big part of the self-understanding that we need to develop when we work with our Enneagram. And certainly the Enneagram types and the Enneagram model of development is something that helps us shine a light in the places that we might need to look to find some of what's blind in us, in order that we can really grow to our full potential. And that's the whole developmental pathway of understanding the false in you, understanding your false self as a teacher, as a guide, as a pathway to getting more and more in touch with your true self, your whole self, that part of you that embraces and accepts all of who you are, not just those parts of yourself that your ego says are comfortable or acceptable based on what became familiar places to hang out in yourself as a way of avoiding something else. So anything else you would say about psychological work, or have we covered that yet?
Well, I just think this is a very complex theme, and we could even think of a future podcast on that. But I also want to refer our listeners to 2 other podcasts that we've already done that somehow help a little bit this understanding. And they were one on emotions and the Enneagram, and the other one on managing reactivity and the Enneagram. And those might bring some more light.
And I think also, especially referring to our levels of awareness model, which we're still working on and will bring out more and more in the coming months. There are, of course, also things to be done around subtype patterns and instincts, working with your dominant instinct, observing it, seeing it in action, sometimes after the fact, and learning to balance out the instincts, learning to give more attention and space and care and love to the repressed part of ourselves, the repressed instinct included, and learning to tone down some of the ways that our dominant instinct can drive the show, as well as arrow work, wing work. And again, the key being at different points in the developmental path, different kinds of psychological work will be important. And it's important to do things in order and to not try to do something that's beyond where you are and is going to just be too challenging, or it's just not speaking to what you need most in the moment. So another aspect of our levels model will very much be the timing of what do you do when. And again, I think people will find this of value, because it will be not only what's the work you need to do generally as a person, as a human, what's the work you need to do based on your specific type and your specific subtype and your specific instinctual sequence, but also what's the timing of this? If you're relatively new to inner work, what do you need to do first, and what do you need to do next? And after you've done that, then what comes? And so I think people will find that of a lot of value. And this is a good question, because it's given us a chance to talk a little bit more about our levels of awareness model that we haven't yet done a podcast on, but that we will be doing sometime in the near future.
Yeah, and you mentioned instinctual sequence. I just want to say that we got some very good questions about that, and we decided that sometime in the future we'll do a whole episode on that.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's probably a good place to stop for now. We want to thank you for your questions. We want to thank you for listening. You're what really makes doing this podcast worthwhile. So I hope you'll continue to pose questions to us. We have a Facebook group, CP Enneagram Academy. You can always email us and let us know what you're thinking about and what you want to know more about. Certainly, you can give us a review to let us know how we're doing in terms of what you think of the podcast. But I think that does it for our questions for this podcast. So again, we want to thank you for listening. And we want to invite you to join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.